John Thompson felt a tinge of excitement as he straightened his suit and took a deep breath. Today marked his first day as CEO of ArcLight Technologies, and he was ready to step into a role that few would have expected him to reach. Walking toward the gleaming glass doors of the skyscraper, he couldn't help but feel a surge of pride. This moment wasn't just a victory for him. It was a victory for every person who had been told they weren't enough because of who they were. But as John approached the security checkpoint in the lobby, the piercing eyes of the guards stopped him in his tracks. Paul, the security officer, stood there with his arms crossed, sizing John up. John noticed the way Paul's eyes narrowed slightly, his lips pressed into a thin line. "Excuse me," John said calmly, offering a small, polite smile as he reached for his identification badge. Paul didn't return the smile. Instead, he stepped forward, blocking John's path. "Can I help you?" he asked, his tone less inquisitive and more confrontational. "I'm here for work," John replied simply, handing over his badge. Paul looked at the ID, barely glancing at the CEO title printed under John's name. "Where exactly are you trying to go?" he questioned, voice hard. John blinked, a slight hesitation in his voice. "The executive floor." A chuckle escaped Paul's lips, one filled with skepticism. He tilted his head, the smirk widening. "Executive floor? Look, buddy, I think you're mistaken. The executive offices aren't exactly open access," he said, his eyes sweeping over John as if appraising every inch of him, from his polished shoes to his tailored suit. "You wouldn't have access?" "I assure you I do," John replied, keeping his tone controlled. He could feel the growing tension in the air, the looks from other employees passing by, stealing glances at the scene unfolding. Paul exhaled, looking down at John's badge as if it were a piece of counterfeit paper. "You think you'd be a little more prepared if you were actually supposed to be there, don't you?" he remarked, his voice almost amused. "Who are you trying to impress with this getup?" John took another breath, steadying himself. "I'm not here to impress anyone. My name is John Thompson, and I'm the new CEO of this company." There was a pause, a silence heavy with disbelief. Paul's brow furrowed as he looked at John's face, then back at the ID, and then back at John. It was as if the words hadn't fully registered. "CEO," Paul finally said, practically laughing now. "You? Look, man, I don't know who sold you that title, but I'd try your luck elsewhere. This is a serious place. ArcLight doesn't just let anyone walk in claiming they're the CEO." The dismissal in Paul's voice stung, but John remained composed. He glanced around, noticing a few employees whispering nearby, their expressions a mix of curiosity and amusement. Clearly, they hadn't been briefed on his arrival. "Maybe if you check with the reception upstairs, they'll confirm what I'm saying," John suggested, struggling to keep his tone even. Paul crossed his arms defiantly. "You want me to take you upstairs so you can play CEO? Is this some kind of prank?" he scoffed, glancing over at the few bystanders, who chuckled nervously in response. "What? You just figured you'd walk in and pretend to be someone important?" At that, John felt his patience beginning to fray. He stepped forward, his gaze firm. "Look, I understand this is unconventional, but I assure you I belong here. Now, if you would kindly—" "You don't belong here," Paul interrupted sharply, his voice loud enough to draw more attention. His eyes flashed with irritation and something else, perhaps a sense of power in holding John back. "You're just another guy trying to bluff his way into a place he doesn't fit. I've seen it before, and I'm not falling for it." John's jaw tightened, but he kept his voice steady. "Sir, if you won't verify my ID, then please call someone who will. I won't keep arguing." A hush fell as Paul glared, his mouth set in a hard line. He finally relented, muttering something under his breath and dialing his supervisor. Every second stretched out painfully, the crowd of onlookers growing as word of the standoff spread. John could feel the weight of their gazes, each one filled with judgment and doubt. "Yeah, I've got someone here claiming he's supposed to be on the executive floor," Paul said into the phone, his tone dripping with disbelief. "Says he's the CEO." He glanced at John, openly smirking. "You'd think the CEO would be a little more convincing," he added, still holding the phone close enough for everyone to hear. Moments later, the supervisor arrived, and Paul gestured toward John dismissively. This guy says he's the new boss or something, he muttered, chuckling as if it were the punchline to a joke. The supervisor approached John, his expression shifting from curiosity to realization. "Mr. Thompson?" he asked, a hint of respect breaking through his surprise. I wasn't aware you'd arrived." Paul's face fell, the color draining as he realized his mistake. But before he could recover, the supervisor turned, eyes flashing with annoyance. "Paul," he said in a low voice, "do you understand what you've done? Mr. Thompson is our new CEO." A stunned silence enveloped the crowd. Paul's mouth opened, then closed, his usual confidence replaced with something closer to panic. I didn't know," he stammered, eyes darting nervously from his supervisor to John. "He didn't look? I thought he was just—" John watched Paul with a steady gaze, the sting of the insult still fresh, but hidden behind a mask of calm. He gave a small nod, choosing his words carefully. "Mr. Paul, I understand assumptions can be deceiving. But this should be a reminder to us all about the importance of respect." Paul swallowed, his gaze dropping to the floor. I'm so sorry, Mr. Thompson," he managed, the words coming out strained. John held his gaze for a moment longer, letting the silence speak before responding. "Thank you, Paul," he said quietly, offering a brief, solemn nod. "Let's consider this a learning moment for all of us." Without another word, John turned and headed toward the elevators, leaving behind a sea of stunned faces and whispers, the weight of the encounter settling heavily around them all. John stepped into the elevator, feeling the tension ease slightly as the doors closed, shielding him from the murmurs and stares that had gathered in the lobby. He leaned back against the polished metal wall, exhaling slowly, his mind replaying the incident with Paul. As much as he wanted to brush it off as a misunderstanding, it wasn't just a minor oversight. It was a pointed reminder of the challenges he'd face here. Not because of his abilities, but because of people's assumptions about him. The elevator dinged, and the doors opened onto the executive floor. Sleek furniture, ambient lighting, and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking New York's skyline greeted him. But despite the beautiful office, John knew the real challenge wasn't the work. It was changing an entire culture that had been ingrained in this company for years. His executive assistant, Laura, approached with a warm smile, clearly aware of his arrival. "Mr. Thompson," she greeted him, extending her hand. "Welcome to ArcLight. We're thrilled to have you." John shook her hand, giving her a small, genuine smile. "Thank you, Laura. It's good to be here," he replied, appreciating her welcoming demeanor. She seemed both efficient and kind, a rare combination in such high-stakes environments. "Your first meeting with the board is in 20 minutes, Laura informed him. "They're eager to hear about your vision for ArcLight." John nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and resolve. This was his chance to set the tone for his tenure, to outline his plans and leave no doubt about the direction he intended to take. 20 minutes later, John entered the boardroom, where the most influential figures at ArcLight sat waiting. He recognized some faces from press clippings and business events, each of them powerful in their own right. But today, he wasn't here to impress anyone with accolades. He was here to lead. He began his presentation, a blend of innovative ideas focused on pushing the company forward and initiatives centered on increasing diversity and inclusion at all levels. John's vision was clear. ArcLight wasn't just going to compete in the tech world. It was going to set new standards, both technologically and culturally. For a while, the board members listened attentively, a few nodding in agreement as John laid out his strategy. But as he delved into his plans for creating a more inclusive workspace, he noticed a subtle shift. One board member, Richard Caldwell, an older man known for his blunt opinions, leaned back in his chair, his expression inscrutable but his gaze piercing. As John wrapped up, he opened the floor for questions. Richard was the first to raise his hand. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his tone polite but tinged with a hint of condescension, "I appreciate your vision. Truly, it's ambitious. But don't you think all these new, inclusive initiatives might distract from the company's core mission? After all, we're a tech company, not a social reform agency." John met Richard's gaze, keeping his expression neutral. "With respect, Mr. Caldwell, I believe that innovation thrives when diverse perspectives are represented. Tech isn't just about machines and data. It's about people, and our products are built to serve a diverse world. Richard raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. That sounds admirable, but these things cost time and resources. What do you say to the shareholders who expect results, not social experiments? A faint murmur echoed around the table, a few board members exchanging glances, some hesitant, others nodding subtly in agreement. John knew he was facing a long-standing resistance, the kind that didn't yield easily. But he also knew his own resilience had brought him here, to this very moment. With all due respect to our shareholders, I believe that true value comes from an engaged and motivated workforce. Diversity and inclusion aren't extras. They're the foundation of a progressive, successful company. In fact, studies show that diverse companies outperform others in productivity and profit. John replied, calm but firm. Richard smirked, folding his arms. Those are nice theories, Mr. Thompson. But, frankly, we're here to make decisions based on hard facts, not ideals. Before John could respond, a voice interrupted. I'd like to hear more about Mr. Thompson's plans. It was Diane Gwynn, one of the few female board members, known for her advocacy of progressive workplace policies. He's right. The tech world is evolving. And if ArcLight wants to stay ahead, we need to reflect the world we're serving. Her support, though unexpected, felt like a lifeline. John acknowledged her with a slight nod, appreciating her willingness to back him, even as the tension in the room thickened. Richard cleared his throat, clearly perturbed. Well, that's one perspective, he replied, his voice icy. But let's not forget why we're here. ArcLight has survived on traditional values for a reason. Too much change, too quickly, and we could risk alienating our client base. John knew he couldn't force them to understand his vision in a single meeting. But he also knew he wouldn't back down. I respect the concerns about tradition, he said, his voice steady. But innovation often demands that we step out of comfort zones. I'm confident that the adjustments I propose will only strengthen our position. My track record speaks to that. Another board member, who had been silent until now, chimed in with a hint of irritation. We're not doubting your track record, Mr. Thompson. But perhaps you should ease into these changes rather than forcing a complete overhaul on day one. Thank you for the feedback, John replied, unfazed. But ArcLight brought me on board, not just to maintain, but to elevate. That means recognizing our opportunities for growth, even if it means challenging old habits. A strained silence hung over the table, and John felt the weight of it settle on him. Yet beneath the tension, he sensed a shift, small, but undeniable. Diane's support, though minor, was a spark. And sometimes, all it took was a single spark to ignite change. The meeting adjourned, and as John packed up his notes, Diane approached him with a smile. You handled that well, she said, her voice low. Richard and his friends may resist, but keep pushing. Change takes time. John nodded, grateful for her encouragement. Thank you, Diane. I'm prepared for the challenge. She placed a hand on his shoulder, offering a reassuring squeeze. Good, because I think you're exactly what ArcLight needs, even if some don't see it yet. As he left the boardroom, John couldn't shake Richard's words from his mind. It was clear this was only the beginning of his uphill battle, but he had come too far to let outdated ideas deter him now. John settled into his new office, gazing out at the New York skyline. The meeting with the board had gone exactly as he'd expected. Cautious support mixed with heavy resistance. While he had allies like Diane, Richard Caldwell's dismissive remarks echoed in his mind, and he knew that Richard wasn't alone in his sentiment. A soft knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. Laura stepped in, looking slightly hesitant. Mr. Thompson, Paul, the security guard from this morning, asked to see you, she said, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. He insists on apologizing in person. John nodded, surprised but open to the conversation. Please send him in, Laura. Moments later, Paul entered, his usual confident stance replaced with visible unease. His gaze darted around, avoiding John's, before finally settling as he forced himself to speak. Mr. Thompson, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened this morning. I shouldn't have assumed or treated you like I did. I was wrong, John watched him, sensing Paul's struggle to own up to his mistake. "Thank you, Paul," he said, his tone measured. "I appreciate the apology, but I think it's important to understand what was at the heart of your reaction." Paul's shoulders tensed, his face turning slightly red. I know. I made a judgment call. Assumed things I shouldn't have," he admitted, glancing down. "It's not easy to admit, but sometimes you think you're just doing your job and you don't see how it comes off to others." John took a deep breath, deciding to share a bit of his story to illustrate the larger impact. "Paul, I've spent my entire career walking into rooms where people doubted I belonged. It happens to a lot of people, and the cost isn't just emotional. It sets up roadblocks, creates distance. It chips away at your sense of belonging." Paul shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but he nodded. "I get it, and I know I need to be better." "I didn't think—" "That's exactly the point," John interrupted gently. "We often don't think because we haven't had to. But everyone here, from the board to you at the door, shapes this company's culture. Small assumptions become large patterns." Paul looked down, clearly absorbing John's words. "I didn't realize I was part of that. I thought, well, that I was just doing my job." John gave a small nod, softening his tone. "And now you know that doing the job is more than following routine. It's understanding what each of us brings. Everyone here should feel respected, and it starts with basic interactions." Paul seemed to take this to heart. "Thank you for not reporting me, Mr. Thompson. I know you had every right to." John simply nodded. "It's more valuable for me if you learn from this and carry it forward. That's worth more than any report." The silence lingered, respectful, and Paul looked at John with something close to admiration. "Thank you, sir. I'll do better. I promise." After Paul left, John sat back, his mind turning over the day's events. He had won one small victory, but he could feel that this job was going to be a marathon of moments just like these, small, personal confrontations that would slowly chip away at the old culture of ArcLight. The intercom buzzed. "Mr. Thompson, Diane is here for your meeting," Laura's voice informed him. "Send her in, please." Diane entered, carrying a few folders and an encouraging smile. "Ready to dive into ArcLight's policies?" she asked, setting the folders on his desk. "You've got a few board members grumbling about your radical ideas for diversity, but I think you've got more support than you know." "Let's hope so," John replied, letting out a slight chuckle. "Richard Caldwell has made his opposition pretty clear." Diane sighed, rolling her eyes. "Richard's been in his position too long to see any changes as beneficial. But he's a businessman at heart, and if he starts seeing results, he'll come around." They began reviewing the company's hiring policies, analyzing data on diversity and inclusion across departments. The numbers were disheartening, revealing that despite its stature, ArcLight was well behind on the very initiatives John was proposing. Diane watched as he scanned the data, noting his reaction. "It's not pretty, is it?" she said, shaking her head. "It's like pulling teeth to get HR to focus on hiring outside of the usual circles." John exhaled, his brow furrowing. "This isn't just a hiring issue. It's a cultural one. We're going to have to address the mindset that's been ingrained here for years." They spent the next hours strategizing, discussing potential training programs, partnerships with diverse organizations, and ways to implement fair hiring practices. As they worked, John felt a renewed sense of purpose. Each obstacle only solidified his resolve. When they finished, Diane stood, gathering her things. "John, just so you know, I believe in what you're doing. And if there's anything you need to get these plans off the ground, just ask. I'll make sure you have it." John met her gaze, appreciating her sincerity. "Thank you, Diane. I'll definitely take you up on that." As she left, John returned to his desk, making notes and preparing for what lay ahead. But just as he was about to call it a night, his phone rang. The caller ID showed it was Richard Caldwell. "Richard," John answered, keeping his voice steady. "How can I help?" "John, I wanted to reach out personally. About today's meeting." Richard's voice was cordial, but laced with something unspoken. "You brought up some interesting ideas. But I have to ask, do you really think all these changes are necessary? ArcLight has been quite successful without them." John felt a flash of frustration, but kept his response measured. "Richard, success isn't just about profit. It's about sustainability, and that means being forward-thinking. Our industry and the world is evolving? Richard chuckled a short, dry sound. Perhaps. But it's worth remembering that ArcLight's history was built on a certain reputation. I'd hate to see that tarnished. The veiled warning in his words was clear, but John didn't flinch. I understand, Richard, but I'm not here to preserve ArcLight's past. I'm here to lead it into the future. A silence lingered on the line before Richard replied, his tone slightly colder. Well, we'll see if the board agrees with that. As the call ended, John felt a pang of exhaustion, but it was coupled with a fierce determination. The battle lines were being drawn, and he was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. He had come this far by refusing to settle, and he wasn't about to stop now. John arrived at ArcLight the next morning with a renewed sense of purpose. The subtle resistance from Richard Caldwell and some board members was more than expected. It was a confirmation of the very obstacles he had been hired to dismantle. This company needed change, and if there was anything he was certain of, it was that he would deliver it, no matter how challenging the path. He was barely settled at his desk when Laura knocked on his door. Her expression was tense, and she held a handful of papers. "Good morning, Mr. Thompson," she greeted him, glancing nervously over her shoulder. "There's something I think you should see." John took the papers from her, his eyes scanning the bold headlines. An internal email chain among several employees had been forwarded to him anonymously. As he read, he felt his jaw tighten. The emails contained snide remarks about his leadership, subtle but unmistakably dismissive comments about his commitment to diversity, and even allusions to his style and approach, terms that seemed suspiciously loaded. One line from Richard Caldwell stood out. "I don't know how long he'll last, but it'll be entertaining to watch him try." John set the papers down, his jaw clenched. Laura watched him cautiously, as if unsure how he'd react. "Is this how the team normally communicates about leadership?" he asked, keeping his tone even. Laura hesitated, then shook her head. "Not usually. But you should know, there's been pushback from some departments, particularly on the changes you proposed in hiring practices and promotion criteria. It's new, and some people feel it's unnecessary." John absorbed her words, his mind already formulating a response. "Laura, if you notice this kind of resistance in communication again, I want to be informed immediately," he said. "Transparency is essential if we're going to build a culture of respect here." Laura nodded, her expression one of relief. "Of course, Mr. Thompson. I'll keep an eye out." After Laura left, John sat back, letting out a slow breath. It was one thing to encounter quiet resistance from the board, but discovering it so openly among staff was a clear indicator of how deeply entrenched the biases here were. Determined to address the situation directly, he called for a company-wide meeting, an open forum where employees could ask questions and share their concerns. He knew it would be difficult, but he also knew it was necessary. Later that day, John stood before a packed auditorium filled with ArcLight's employees. The atmosphere was charged with anticipation. Many employees exchanged glances, whispering to one another as he took the stage. John let the murmurs settle before speaking. "Thank you all for being here," he began, his voice carrying a calm authority. "I wanted to speak with you today because I believe that ArcLight's strength lies in its people, and that includes every one of you. But I've noticed something troubling, a resistance to the changes we've begun discussing." He paused, looking out over the audience, noting the various reactions. Some curious, others skeptical, a few outright indifferent. "I've come to understand that the concerns around these changes aren't just professional, they're personal. And I get that. Change is uncomfortable, especially when it disrupts long-standing habits." One employee raised his hand, and John motioned for him to speak. "Mr. Thompson," the man said, his voice unsure, "some of us feel like these diversity initiatives are just PR stunts. They don't really affect the core business." John nodded, taking in the question. "I appreciate your honesty," he replied. "Let me assure you, these changes are not just about appearance. We're creating an environment where each voice, each perspective, has value. When you work in a place where respect and opportunity are guaranteed for everyone, the core business thrives." A woman in the back spoke up. "But what if these changes actually hurt performance? I mean, hiring just for the sake of diversity?" John cut her off gently, but firmly. This isn't about hiring just for diversity. It's about ensuring that talented individuals from all backgrounds have an equal chance to contribute. Diversity in teams isn't a compromise on quality. It's an enhancement of it. Studies have proven that diverse workplaces are more innovative and productive. A low murmur rippled through the room, some employees nodding thoughtfully, others looking skeptical. Then Richard Caldwell's voice sounded from the back of the room, breaking the tentative silence. "Mr. Thompson, we've heard a lot about what you want to change. But what about what's already working here? There's a reason ArcLight has been successful." John turned, meeting Richard's gaze. The challenge in his eyes was clear, and the room seemed to tense in response. "Richard, I respect ArcLight's success, and I'm here to build on it," John replied, his voice unwavering. "But success isn't a shield from growth. In fact, it should push us to do better. The world is changing, and our company needs to reflect that. If we don't adapt, we risk falling behind." A faint scoff escaped Richard's lips. "It's easy to talk about adaptation, but what you're proposing sounds like a complete overhaul. And not everyone here signed up for that." John's expression didn't falter. "I understand that change is uncomfortable, but I'm not asking for an overhaul. I'm leading us toward evolution. And I believe that if we all work together, the results will speak for themselves." Diane, who had been watching from the front row, raised her hand. "If I may," she began, turning to the crowd. "I've been with ArcLight for years, and I've seen firsthand how change can bring new energy and ideas. We brought John on for a reason, to help us evolve." A ripple of agreement ran through parts of the audience, and John felt a glimmer of hope. Diane's voice carried weight, and her support was invaluable. As the meeting wound down, John took a deep breath, addressing the room one last time. "I'm not here to erase ArcLight's history. I'm here to lead it into the future. And that future is inclusive, innovative, and grounded in respect for everyone. I ask only that you give these changes a fair chance." After the meeting ended, employees began filing out of the auditorium, some glancing at him with curiosity, others still skeptical, but many with expressions that showed a willingness to listen. As the room emptied, Richard approached him. "That was quite a performance," he said, his tone unreadable. "It wasn't a performance," John replied evenly. "I believe in what I'm saying, Richard, and I'm not asking for permission to change things. I'm here to make those changes." Richard's mouth twisted in a slight smirk. "Just remember, not everyone's as optimistic about this as you are. Some of us think ArcLight was doing just fine." John met his gaze without wavering. "Fine isn't enough anymore. Not for this company, and not for the world we live in. If that's hard to accept, well, I guess we'll have to agree to disagree." Richard didn't respond, just offered a curt nod before turning and walking away, leaving John standing alone in the emptying auditorium. John knew he had stirred something within the company, a sense of both uncertainty and anticipation. This was just the beginning, and he was ready for every challenge that lay ahead. Over the next few months, John's initiatives began to ripple through the company. Slowly, ArcLight's culture started to shift. Employees who had initially been skeptical found themselves engaged in discussions about inclusivity and innovation, and new perspectives emerged, adding vibrancy to a workplace that had grown stagnant under outdated practices. Paul, the security guard, had become an unexpected ally in John's mission. Humbled by his initial encounter with John, he had thrown himself into company-wide training programs, setting an example that even the most routine interactions mattered. He became known for his kindness and attentiveness, embodying the principles that John championed. Employees started to notice his transformation, realizing that real change often started with small acts of respect and open-mindedness. One afternoon, John received an email from Richard Caldwell's office, requesting a meeting. The invitation was sudden, and though he had gained some ground with the board, he knew Richard's support was still tenuous. Entering Richard's office, John noted the reserved expression on Richard's face, his usual confidence giving way to something unreadable. "Thank you for meeting me, John," Richard began, his tone measured. "I wanted to speak with you about the recent company performance." John nodded. "Of course. I've been monitoring the progress reports closely." Richard shifted, tapping his fingers against his desk. "The numbers are promising," he admitted, a hint of reluctance in his voice. "Our productivity has increased, and employee retention rates are better than expected. Frankly, it's surprising." John allowed himself a small smile. When employees feel valued and respected, they tend to perform better. "I believe these results are proof of that." Richard seemed to consider this, his expression softening, if only slightly. "I'll admit, I didn't expect these unorthodox methods to yield anything but friction. But seeing these numbers, I'm forced to reconsider." He paused, glancing at John. "Maybe I underestimated you." The admission was small, but from Richard it was monumental. John felt a surge of satisfaction, tempered by caution. "Thank you, Richard. I appreciate your openness. And I understand that change can be difficult, especially in a company with a long history." Richard sighed, leaning back in his chair. "I won't pretend I'm completely on board with everything you're doing, but I can see there's value in some of these changes. Just proceed with care." "I intend to," John assured him, understanding that this was as close to an endorsement as he might get from Richard. "ArcLight's legacy is important to me too, but it's a legacy that should continue to evolve." Richard gave a brief nod, acknowledging the sentiment. "Very well then, let's see where this goes." The meeting ended on a tentative note of mutual respect, and as John left Richard's office, he felt a weight lifting. Richard's grudging acknowledgement marked a breakthrough, not just for the board, but for ArcLight itself. He knew he was laying the foundation for something lasting, a culture that valued progress as much as tradition. Days later, John decided to hold a company-wide event to celebrate the recent success, acknowledging the employees who had embraced change and worked together to make ArcLight a more welcoming place. He wanted this celebration to serve as both a thank you and a reminder of the collective journey they were on. As he addressed the employees in the large, decorated hall, John spoke with a newfound pride. "We've come a long way in a short time," he began, his voice resonating through the room. "And it's not because of one person, but because of each of you. This journey hasn't been easy, and I know it's asked a lot from everyone here. But I believe that together, we're building something remarkable." He looked out over the crowd, seeing faces he now recognized. Not just as employees, but as individuals who had come to understand the importance of mutual respect and inclusivity. Paul was among them, standing near the back with a quiet smile, nodding in agreement with John's words. After the event, as people mingled and celebrated, Paul approached John, a glint of pride in his eyes. "Mr. Thompson," he began, his voice soft, "I wanted to thank you for that day. I'm not sure I'd be the man I am now if you hadn't handled things the way you did." John placed a hand on Paul's shoulder, smiling warmly. "I'm proud of you, Paul. You've shown everyone here what real growth looks like. That's more valuable than any title." Paul looked down, slightly embarrassed but clearly moved. "It means a lot, sir. Really. And I think ArcLight is in good hands with you leading." As Paul walked away, John felt a sense of fulfillment settle over him. It was one thing to implement changes, but it was another to witness the real human impact they had on people's lives. It reminded him why he had fought so hard to reach this position. In the weeks that followed, ArcLight continued to thrive, the new cultural initiatives blending seamlessly into the daily rhythm of the company. Employees began to take pride in the organization's evolution, and word spread within the industry, positioning ArcLight as a leader in both technology and corporate responsibility. Richard Caldwell, while still cautious, became more collaborative in board meetings, lending his support where it mattered. Diane remained a steadfast ally, and even the most skeptical board members found it difficult to argue with the results. One evening, as John prepared to leave the office, Laura knocked on his door. "Mr. Thompson, a reporter from the New York Times, just called. They're interested in doing a profile on you and ArcLight's new direction." John smiled, feeling the weight of the past few months culminate in this moment. "That sounds good, Laura. Let's make it happen." As he walked through the empty office, heading toward the elevators, he reflected on everything that had brought him here. He had faced skepticism, judgment, and outright resistance, but he had also found allies, discovered resilience, and witnessed change. The elevator doors closed, and as he descended, John felt a deep, quiet satisfaction. He had not only reshaped ArcLight, he had left a mark on every person who had doubted, challenged, or stood by him. And with each step, he knew he was paving the way for others to rise, to lead, and to redefine what was possible in a world that still had so much to learn. When he reached the lobby, he found Paul there, nodding at him with the same respectful smile he now offered everyone. John nodded back, a silent acknowledgement of how far they had both come. Together, they had turned ArcLight into a place where everyone could walk through the doors with dignity. And as John stepped out into the New York night, he knew this was just the beginning of a journey that would continue, one act of change at a time.